Hi, my name is Geeta Minocha. I'm a senior in Wharton studying strategic management and business economics and public policy. I am also minoring in history, and so I will be doing my Ben talk on a project that I did through a course in the communications department with Professor David Eisenhower. My independent research project with the Eisenhower course was on the Theodore Roosevelt administration and its influence on 20th century Japanese-American relations, and in particular, how the administration impacted the later Japanese decision to bomb Pearl Harbor in World War II. So I approached this project from a number of different dimensions. From prior knowledge, I knew that in negotiations with Russia and with Japan in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War, Theodore Roosevelt had created in the Treaty of Portsmouth an agreement that sort of isolated the Japanese and failed to actually give them what they felt was their earned spoils in terms of territory and in terms of trading rights. And they were particularly bitter about that. They never quite forgot about that. But just a couple of years later, at the end of his administration, Roosevelt had sent out the new and improved United States Navy. He had spent the entirety of his public service career advocating for a stronger and more robust American Navy. And so he was Secretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary of the Navy prior to becoming Vice President and then, of course, President. And so he spent the entirety of his career doing this. And so when he obtained the highest public office possible, he began a massive push to, again, reinvigorate that Navy. And as soon as the building was complete, he sent out the Navy on a tour of the world, and it was known as the Great White Fleet. It toured all of the continents, and it made stops at all of the major powers and all of the up-and-coming powers as well. It was a very thinly veiled threat, essentially, to any power that might consider itself strong enough to oppose the United States and its interests. So Japan in particular took this to be, again, a very aggressive and threatening gesture. And this is something that I wanted to study a little bit more in depth. But in doing my research at the Library of Congress, and I spent a number of days there for the purposes of this research project, I came across a completely new facet of Roosevelt's diplomacy that I had not even considered in my initial considerations of the foreign policy. And that was in particular the San Francisco question. The San Francisco question refers to the segregation of Japanese Americans from public schools in the city of San Francisco. And this was issued by Mayor Eugene Schmitz, who was mayor of the city from, I believe, 1904 until about 1909, 1910. And he was actually nationally infamous because of his real hatred for Asian immigrants, and in particular, his hatred for Japanese immigrants. So in October of 1906, 93 Japanese students tried to attend their public school as they had been doing for so long, and they were actually barred from entry by members of the San Francisco police from orders by Mayor Schmitz. And this was an incredibly insulting gesture to not only the Japanese American population, but also the Japanese Empire, because so many immigrant Japanese had family and friends back home that they still communicated with on a regular basis. So this was a real slight to really the Japanese diaspora as a whole. In addition to that, there was a logistical concern that developed because of this segregation. In the aftermath of the very devastating 1906 earthquake from April of that year, a number of the Japanese neighborhoods in the city had been completely demolished, absolutely destroyed. And so a number of these Japanese were forced to relocate to the city's Chinatown, which was comparatively intact. And so Chinatown, for a number of subsequent years, encompassed not only the city's Chinese population, but as was custom in a number of smaller cities, also included a number of Japanese Americans and Korean Americans. The problem here, though, was that the Chinatown was not close by. It was actually on the other side of the city from the public schools that San Francisco officials would allow the Japanese students to attend. So you just had a very logistical issue of mobility here. These kids and their families were not able to physically reach the schools that they were allowed to attend. And so it was really barring these immigrant students from obtaining a public education that was promised to them from the city. So it was just a further injury to Japanese Americans. So Theodore Roosevelt heard of this, and it's no secret that the Roosevelt administration, many senior members of the administration, and really Roosevelt himself, they were not necessarily in favor of racial equality by any means. And in fact, they did tend to view all foreigners as being inferior to Americans, to people born and bred in the United States, and in particular white Americans. But that being said, Roosevelt understood that the Japanese Empire had become a power to be really wary of in terms of its military might. And the United States at this point in time didn't have all of its Pacific strongholds that you'll see pop up in the 20th century. This is something that he wants to develop. And he wants to develop this as a means of buffering the country from especially the Japanese Empire. So he understands that this is a bit of a diplomatic issue, and that it could actually result in a real military threat to the United States interests. So he immediately attempts to do some damage control. He goes in front of Congress in December of 1906, just a couple of months after the schools have been segregated in San Francisco, and he gives a really powerful State of the Union address. And what's very telling about this address is that the vast majority of time is actually spent discussing the San Francisco question. He seems to almost gloss over other domestic and international issues of note, to focus pretty much exclusively on Japanese relations and on what's happening in San Francisco. And one of the things he does is he very passionately reaffirms the United States' commitment to Asian immigrants, and especially to Japanese immigrants. And then he goes on to reaffirm the American intentions in the Pacific. And he says something like, the United States has a very profound and compelling duty to the peoples of the Orient. And this is a really significant statement, because again, with this statement, he is re-emphasizing the United States' claim to economic interest in the Pacific, but more than that, he's also reiterating a commitment to diplomacy with the peoples of the Pacific. He sees this as being a very lasting relationship. And this speech as a whole is very telling, because despite his personal views, despite a number of correspondence between Roosevelt and close friends like statesman Henry Cabot Lodge or diplomat Cecil Spring Rice, despite correspondence that indicates very clearly that he does not like Japanese people, that he does not really respect Japanese immigrants or the Japanese Empire, he is really essentially sucking up to them, and he's doing it because he's scared. He knows that they're a threat and that they could potentially harm the United States, and he's trying to do everything he can diplomatically to clean up this mess that Mayor Schmitz has made. So this is just a very interesting moment. And what happens in the next couple of months is Mayor Schmitz just really doubles down on his policy of segregation, and we're seeing riots erupt in Chinatown as a result of his policy. People are protesting the unfair treatment. But Schmitz is just cracking down. He's instructing his law enforcement to go in and to be very violent with anyone that seems to be protesting the city policy. And the Japanese Empire is hearing all of this and is insisting that the Roosevelt administration step in and do something. But Roosevelt here is in a bit of a conflict, because he is loyal to this idea of federalism, that ultimately a municipality or a state should have the authority to govern the people within its own borders, and that the federal government should have less of an authority. And he doesn't know what to do, and he's stuck. And so in this difficult position, he opts to essentially maintain the status quo and continue to let Schmitz run the city of San Francisco the way that he's been doing. And he steps back. And this is incredibly important and a real turning point in Japanese-American relations, because the Roosevelt administration, it was important not just because of the actions of the city of San Francisco. It was significant for the inaction that was coming from the Roosevelt administration. And the Japanese really expected him to come up and say something and stop this unfair treatment of their people. And when he didn't do that, he sort of solidified a rift that was to remain between the two nations for many, many decades afterwards. Thank you.